first part of it with the testosterone issue, that's a fact, right? So that's a research fact. The second part is my anecdotal experience, and it comes back to also, how do you prevent these injuries? Well, you coach them up and you show them how to jump correctly and you show them how to cut correctly and you give them the prerequisites and the strength that they need to have, and you teach them how to keep their trunk in the right position whenever they're doing these specific high risk mechanics in cutting and deceleration. And basically, with that, as the speed of play changes as they get older, you typically see an increased frequency of these injuries. And I've kind of deduced that over the years. But again, what it really comes down to is we see that they consistently put their foot outside of their center of gravity with their trunk in the wrong position. They go into internal rotation at the femur in this dynamic knee valgus positioning, right? Consistently over and over again, which is typically associated with hip weakness, hamstring weakness, delayed firing of the hamstrings in and of themselves, and poor core and trunk proprioception. Does that make sense? Right? And so basically, when you look at that, again, coming back to that, there is no advantage to going into that position. Right? So that's the other side of it, right? Where you come back to Usain Bolt putting his knee into valgus as he's getting ready to come, as he's coming out of the blocks. There's an advantage to that, because when you get your foot more into that medial position, you stay on the power line so you can go straight ahead coming out of the blocks. When the foot is outside of the center of gravity, during this cutting task, especially that we're talking about, as you're going to change direction, the reason, one of the reasons why the trunk has to shift so much is because you have to do a second kind of counter preparatory movement to be able to change direction. So as that foot hits, I have to shift my weight to pull my body back in the correct direction, right? So there's no mechanical advantage to getting into that dynamic knee valgus position. It only is something that's going to decrease your performance, decrease your quickness and agility. So from that point, it's like, well, why would you want to let an athlete continuously go into that position? If you're coaching, and looking at player development and skill development versus, like we talked about before, in this long-term athletic development idea, versus putting winning and, championships ahead, right, of player development, you would look at starting to fix this as soon as you would see it, right, in all of your players, especially, if you have any type of strength and conditioning program, which is, again, what we see in the research that these guys, Tim Hewitt and the group out of Cincinnati did. They screened for these. They showed that they were able to predict, based on 3D motion analysis, which girls were at higher risk from ACL tears based upon these parameters that they were testing, right? They're testing the strength, the core proprioception, the ability to control your trunk and your base of stability during hop testing, where they had this really cool platform. As you were hopping, it could tell how far you were landing away from your center of gravity, or this area of base of support, and how far all over the place that the foot strikes were. And they were able to make predictions off of these measures to determine which girls were at higher risk. And those predictions showed true. But then they also followed up and said, okay, well, if this is true, then if this is all biomechanical and neuromuscular, can we prevent this? And in some of their studies, they were showing, decreased ACL injury risk and actual tears up to 90-95% in some of the studies when they were doing these trainings. So that's the biggest factor for this, is that it is something that is trainable. Right? So that was why I got into it. Like, as I said at the beginning, non-contact injuries are almost 100% entirely preventable. Right? And that's because it has this huge training component where we can train people and decrease their risk for having injuries. Even just strength training alone has a big, factor on decreasing, risk for injury. But that's the challenge with this, because it's more neuromuscular and biomechanics. Strength training in and of itself doesn't necessarily correct for this. You actually have to go through the coaching, learn how to do your plyometrics and your landing and your changes of direction and all of those things through appropriate coaching.